On a cold winter Sunday in 2012, the small town was alive with the familiar rituals of faith. Families gathered in the pews of a historic stone church, the kind of place where time itself seemed to pause. High vaulted ceilings caught the echo of voices as the choir rehearsed, their young voices rising and falling in harmony beneath the weight of the organ pipes above. Among them was a 12-year-old boy, bright-eyed, with a gentle presence that seemed to blend seamlessly into the group. He was one of dozens lined up in rows, practicing hymns that would later fill the sanctuary for the evening service. To the congregation, it was an ordinary night. To his family, it was supposed to be routine, another Sunday evening at choir practice. But before the night ended, that sense of routine would shatter forever. The boy's parents sat in the back pew as they often did, letting him rehearse while chatting quietly with other families. Practice stretched on, the choir master correcting notes, adjusting the timing, rehearsing pieces again and again. At last, the session wound down and children filed out in small groups, scarves wrapped around their necks against the winter air. Parents stood near the entrance, watching the steady stream of kids filter outside. But as the crowd thinned, one face was missing. Their son never came through the doorway. At first, they assumed he was lagging behind. Maybe he was joking with friends, maybe he'd gone back for his coat, maybe he was still collecting sheet music. They told themselves it was nothing. The parents waited another few minutes, scanning the crowd, asking other children if they had seen him. The answers were all the same. He had been there, standing near the front, singing like always. No one had noticed him leaving. The parents retraced their steps back into the church. The choir loft was empty now, just scattered hymnals on the benches and faint footprints on the carpet. The aisles stretched out before them, lit by dim lanterns, but no sign of their son. They checked the bathrooms, the stairwell that led to the bell tower, even the basement hall where supplies were kept. Each door opened to silence. He wasn't there. By then, their worry had shifted into panic. They asked the choir master if he'd dismissed the boy, if maybe he had left with a different group. The choir master shook his head, insisting he had seen the boy only minutes before, standing near the organ loft. But in the chaos of dismissal, he hadn't noticed if he walked out. The parents spread out, their voices echoing against the stone walls as they called his name. Other families joined in, combing through the church, peering into every corner. The building was old, with hidden staircases and narrow passages that led to storage rooms few even remembered existed. The parents searched all of them, hearts racing faster with each locked door and each empty space. Minutes turned to nearly an hour, and still nothing. The sanctuary felt colder now, the sound of footsteps and whispered voices filling the void where their son should have been. Someone suggested maybe he had slipped outside unnoticed, maybe he had wandered home on his own. Hope flickered in their minds, and the family rushed out into the night air, scanning the dark street. But there was no sign of him. The sidewalks were empty, the snow untouched. Their house sat only a few blocks away, but when they called home, no one had seen him. By the time the clock neared midnight, the last fragile excuses had collapsed. This was no misunderstanding. Their son was gone. The parents picked up the phone with trembling hands and called the police. The dispatcher's calm voice contrasted with the rising terror in the mother's. Within minutes, officers arrived at the church, their radios crackling in the still night. Flashlights cut across the wooden pews, sweeping over statues, hymnals, and the tall organ pipes that loomed silently above. The parents stood back as the police began their sweep. Every closet, every basement corridor, every stairwell was searched again, but the officers, too, found nothing. The boy had been in choir practice, dozens of people had seen him, and then suddenly, he wasn't. The air inside the church was thick with disbelief, the impossible beginning to feel real. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the town in silence. Neighbors gathered near the church steps, whispering in uneasy voices as squad cars lined the street. In the distance, the sound of dogs barking grew closer. Tracking dogs had been called in, their handlers guiding them toward the entrance. The animals sniffed, circled, and then led their handlers to the altar, only to lose the trail entirely. No scent outside, no tracks in the snow. It was as if the boy had simply vanished within the walls. The parents clung to each other, numb with fear. Hours earlier, they had kissed their son goodbye, expecting to see him after practice. Now, the night stretched into uncertainty, every passing minute widening the gulf between what should have been and what had just unfolded. The church bells struck 1 in the morning, their sound reverberating through the empty streets, and still there was no trace. The officers began to expand their search, questioning parishioners, checking the doors and windows for signs of forced entry. Nothing was broken, nothing was disturbed. The church remained locked in its ordinary stillness, holding a mystery no one could yet explain. By dawn, the town would wake to the shocking news. A boy had disappeared from choir practice, and no one had seen him leave. And in the quiet hours of that first night, as police lights reflected against stained glass windows, one question haunted everyone present. How could a child vanish without a trace, inside a place that was supposed to be safe? The police wasted no time. Within the first hour of the call, the church was sealed off, its heavy wooden doors shut as officers began the painstaking task of searching every corner. Flashlights swept over pews and alcoves, across the stone walls that had stood for more than a century. The sanctuary, normally a place of comfort, now felt like a crime scene. Officers moved methodically, starting with the choir loft where the boy was last seen. They checked hymnals, climbed ladders to inspect the rafters, and looked behind curtains where robes hung in neat rows. Nothing. The loft gave no answers, only silence. From there, they moved to the back halls, pushing open closet doors where vestments were stored. Dust stirred in the air, coats rustled, but no sign of the missing child. The church was old, a maze of narrow staircases and forgotten passageways that twisted into basements and storage rooms. Officers made note of how easy it would be for someone to hide within its walls. Every door was tested, every keyhole examined. They found discarded boxes, broken furniture, and the faint scent of mildew, but nothing that explained how a boy could disappear in front of so many witnesses. By 2 in the morning, the K-9 units arrived. Handlers guided their dogs through the aisles, letting them sniff the boy's jacket, which his parents had brought from home. The animals pulled eagerly, noses low to the ground, weaving between pews before circling back toward the altar. The handlers called out the result. The scent ended there. Not near a door, not at a window, but right in front of the altar where countless parishioners had prayed. Beyond that point, it vanished. The parents clutched each other as the meaning sank in. The dogs could trace their son only so far, as though the trail simply evaporated inside the church itself. Officers discussed the possibility that he had been carried out, but the snow outside was pristine. No fresh footprints, no disturbed drifts leading away from the building. It made little sense. If the boy had been taken, how could no one have noticed, and how could the snow bear no trace? Detectives began interviewing parishioners one by one. Most remembered the boy singing, his voice blending with the others, standing near the organ loft. But after the final hymn, no one recalled seeing him again. Some insisted he had gone toward the loft stairs, others swore he had been near the front row. The stories conflicted, blurring into a fog of uncertainty. With each interview, the detectives grew more uneasy. Attention turned quickly to the idea of abduction. The side doors of the church were checked for signs of tampering, but every lock was intact, every latch secure. Windows were shut tight against the cold. There was no forced entry, no damage, no clue of a break-in. Yet the boy was gone, and the simplest explanation seemed to be that someone inside had taken him. The suspicion was devastating for the congregation, many of whom had known each other for decades. But the police had no choice but to treat everyone as a potential witness or suspect. The choir master, a man who had worked in the church for nearly 30 years, was pulled aside. He admitted seeing the boy minutes before practice ended, standing near the organ loft. When pressed, he couldn't account for the boy's movements afterward. The uncertainty weighed heavily, and the man's inability to give clear answers placed him under a shadow of suspicion. Parents who had once trusted him with their children now looked at him with doubt. Meanwhile, officers returned to the organ itself. The towering structure of pipes and wood loomed above them, silent now. They tapped the panels, shined lights between the gaps, but saw nothing unusual. To them, it was just another feature of the old church, intimidating but harmless. They moved on, more focused on the idea of human interference than hidden places. As dawn approached, detectives expanded their search into the surrounding grounds. They scoured the cemetery that lay behind the church, rows of snow-covered stones stretching into the distance. They swept the parking lot, checked nearby alleys, and spoke with residents whose homes overlooked the street. No one had seen a boy leave. No one had noticed a car idling nearby. No one recalled hearing a struggle. It was as though the child had vanished into thin air. Back inside, officers grew increasingly frustrated. Every pew had been checked, every stairwell cleared. The basement corridors, damp and shadowed, yielded nothing more than old hymnals and broken chairs. The scent trail still ended at the altar, and without physical evidence they had no clear direction. Some investigators whispered about hidden chambers, secret crawl spaces built into old churches long ago. But no floorboards gave way, no panels revealed hidden doors. By the time the sun rose, the first sweep had ended in confusion and dread. Families gathered outside the church in disbelief, watching police tape flutter in the cold wind. A boy had vanished from choir practice, leaving behind no signs of departure, no trail to follow. For the community, the unthinkable had become reality. If a child could disappear here, in the heart of their sanctuary, then nowhere was safe. And as the first day of the search drew to a close, detectives faced a chilling truth. The evidence pointed not outward, but inward. If the boy hadn't left the church, then the church itself, its walls, its people, its hidden corners, might be the key to the mystery. In the days that followed the disappearance, the church that had once stood as the town's anchor became a place of unease. Word spread quickly, and whispers filled kitchens, school hallways, and grocery store aisles. Parents who once trusted the safety of choir practice began questioning everything they thought they knew. The boy had been there one moment and gone the next, and with no clear answers from investigators, people began creating their own. The choir master, a man with decades of service to the parish, found himself at the center of suspicion. Known for his patience and gentle demeanor, he had guided generations of children through hymns and rehearsals. But detectives pressed him harder with each interview. They wanted exact times, precise details of when he last saw the boy and why he couldn't recall his movements afterward. The man repeated his account again and again. The boy had been near the organ loft as practice ended, and then he was gone. His inability to explain more placed him under a shadow that no words could dispel. In the eyes of the community, the kindness he had shown for years now carried an unsettling weight. Police widened their focus to include volunteers and parish staff. Every usher, janitor, and church elder was questioned about their whereabouts that night. Investigators checked schedules, cell phone records, and travel routes. Parents of the other children were asked where they stood during dismissal, who they had spoken to, and whether they had noticed anything unusual. None of it broke the silence. Every timeline was airtight, every alibi solid. The boy had vanished without anyone stepping out of line, which only deepened the mystery. The absence of answers created a vacuum quickly filled with speculation. Some families pointed to the side doors, suggesting perhaps one had been left unlocked. An opportunistic stranger could have slipped in and out unnoticed. But detectives had examined the locks and nothing suggested tampering. Others whispered that the boy might have run away, though the thought seemed implausible. He had no history of conflict at home, no indication of planning, no belongings missing from his room. Running away would have meant stepping into the freezing winter night in only the clothes he wore to practice, and even the harshest skeptics admitted that didn't make sense. As theories spread, darker ideas took hold. The town was not immune to rumors of secret societies and hidden rituals, and some began to connect the boy's disappearance with shadowy stories passed down for decades. They wondered aloud whether the church held secrets within its thick stone walls, places untouched for generations, places where something or someone could hide. Parents who once felt safe within the sanctuary now eyed its corridors as if they concealed something sinister. The gossip wasn't confined to the town either. Local papers carried the story, framing the mystery as both baffling and disturbing. Radio shows speculated late into the night, planting seeds of fear that grew quickly. The boy's parents, caught between grief and suspicion, found themselves treated differently by those around them. Friends delivered meals and kind words, but quietly asked whether there had been arguments at home, whether the child had reason to leave on his own. Every question felt like a knife twisting deeper. The family insisted there was no conflict, no trouble at home, nothing that explained why their son wouldn't return. But the more they defended themselves, the more they realized they weren't just battling loss. They were battling the judgment of an entire community trying to make sense of the senseless. Police, aware of the rising paranoia, began releasing small updates. They confirmed there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence pointing to an outside intruder. Instead of reassuring the town, those words fueled the belief that the answer lay within the congregation. Neighbors who had worshipped side by side for years now avoided eye contact, wondering if the person responsible could be sitting in the next pew. Trust, once unshakable, began to unravel thread by thread. Detectives searched for physical evidence, anything that might cut through the noise of rumor. They examined the boy's last known path inside the church, tested surfaces for fingerprints, and rechecked storage areas for overlooked items. But every lead collapsed into nothing. No blood, no fibers, no sign of struggle. The building remained immaculate, as though it had swallowed the boy whole without leaving a trace. The lack of evidence became its own torment, each absence of proof sharpening the paranoia. As weeks turned into months, the investigation's failure weighed heavily on the town. Parents refused to let their children attend evening rehearsals. Some left the parish entirely, unwilling to set foot inside a place tied to such a mystery. Those who stayed avoided talking about the case in public, afraid of fanning the flames of suspicion. But in private, the whispers grew louder. Was it a mistake to trust the church? Could someone they knew and respected have been involved? Was there something hidden in the architecture itself, passages or voids where the boy could have disappeared? The theories multiplied until they blurred into obsession. Each unanswered question felt like an accusation. The community's grief had no outlet, and so it turned inward, feeding on itself. And in the middle of it all, the boy's parents waited, watching the world they once trusted splinter around them, knowing that every new day without answers only widened the gap between faith and fear. As the first year drew to a close, the town had exhausted its energy in speculation and suspicion. But what no one could admit aloud was the most terrifying possibility of all. If no one inside the church was guilty and no intruder had come in from outside, then the building itself might hold the truth. And that possibility was one the community wasn't ready to face. The investigation widened quickly. Once detectives realized the church itself held no clear answers, the search spilled outward into the streets and fields that surrounded it. By dawn, volunteers gathered in heavy coats, their breath visible in the freezing air as they prepared to sweep through the town's wooded edges. Officers directed lines of people through snow-dusted cemeteries, across open fields and into the skeletal remains of forests that bordered the community. Every step crunched against the ice, every voice calling his name echoed back without reply. It was bitterly cold, the kind of morning where survival without shelter was measured in hours, not days. Helicopters rose into the sky, their searchlights cutting across rooftops and farmland. From above, the grid of streets and fences seemed too small to conceal a child, and yet no trace appeared. The pilot reported nothing unusual, just the quiet geometry of a sleeping town. Meanwhile, officers trudged along the frozen riverbanks, probing through reeds and cracking ice along the shoreline. The fear of finding something in the water weighed on everyone, yet the river offered only silence. The urgency pushed authorities to escalate. An Amber Alert was issued, broadcasting the boy's description across the state. Highway signs lit up with his name, urging drivers to report any sighting. Radios repeated the details every half hour. Strangers far from the town now knew his face, his height, the color of his coat. But despite the reach of the alert, not a single credible tip arrived. Investigators circled back to technology, hoping cameras had caught what human eyes had missed. Stores near the church had security systems, and traffic lights recorded passing cars. But when detectives pulled the footage, they found nothing useful. One camera froze at 9 that night, its tape corrupted. Another pointed directly at the street but showed only static during the critical window of time. Others, angled away or poorly maintained, offered no glimpse of the boy. The coincidence was troubling. On the very night a child vanished, nearly every system that could have provided clarity failed at once. The absence of witnesses was just as troubling. The church sat in the center of town, surrounded by houses and lit by street lamps. Yet no neighbor recalled seeing a child slip outside. No driver remembered slowing for someone crossing the road. No passerby noticed a struggle. Dozens of people had attended choir that night, but not one could confirm the boy leaving the building. It left detectives in a bind. If the boy had gone outside, someone should have seen him. If he had never left, then where could he possibly be? The boy's parents joined search efforts, moving through the woods with flashlights, refusing to give in to exhaustion. Neighbors brought food and blankets, trying to help in any way they could. Yet beneath the surface of solidarity ran a current of dread. Each hour that passed without discovery meant the chances of finding him alive grew slimmer. People began to whisper the unspoken truth, that maybe the boy wasn't outside at all, that perhaps he had never left the church grounds. Police resources stretched thin. Officers rotated in and out of shifts, but every new team returned with the same report: nothing found. Cadaver dogs were introduced, handlers guiding them through snow, hoping for even the faintest lead. But just as before, the trail ended abruptly near the altar. Beyond that point, the animals refused to pull forward. They sat back, confused, as though whatever scent they carried had simply vanished. Authorities tried to counter the rising despair with methodical persistence. Dive teams checked sections of the river despite the ice. Drones buzzed overhead, scanning for footprints missed by human eyes. Volunteers combed through barns and abandoned sheds at the town's edge. Still, every effort collapsed into silence. The countryside yielded no answers, no clothing, no evidence of passage. The boy's name echoed across the valley for days, carried by hundreds of voices, but no voice ever answered back. The lack of results fueled tension within the investigative team. Some detectives argued it had to be an abduction, that someone had planned this carefully and removed the boy without leaving a trace. Others leaned toward accident or runaway, though the evidence didn't support it. The debate grew louder, but in the end, both sides confronted the same problem: the total absence of proof. Weeks later, the church bells tolled as usual, but the sound struck differently. For the town, each ringing note became a reminder that the sanctuary at the center of their lives now held a secret it refused to give up. Investigators filed reports, closed off search zones, and gradually shifted the case into a slower phase. Families who once walked the streets freely now clutched their children's hands tighter, glancing at every stranger as though danger could be hidden in plain sight. The official narrative said the boy disappeared during choir practice, last seen inside the church. Search parties had covered every field, forest, and river in miles of territory. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers, and police had scoured every inch of ground. Yet the boy had not been found outside. The conclusion weighed on everyone, heavy and impossible to ignore. If no one had seen him leave, and no sign of him existed in the world beyond the sanctuary, then the truth of what happened might still be sealed within the walls of that old church. The first winter after the boy's disappearance passed in a haze of unanswered questions. Search efforts slowed, though his parents refused to let go. They showed up at the police station weekly, sitting across from detectives who had nothing new to tell them. Officers admitted quietly that every lead had been run down, every search zone combed through, every witness pressed until there was nothing left to press. Without fresh evidence, the case grew stagnant, though no one dared to call it that aloud. For the family, the silence from investigators felt like another loss layered on top of the first. Spring brought no renewal. Posters with the boy's photograph remained taped to shop windows, though the paper yellowed under the sun and curled at the corners. Families in town drifted gradually back to their routines. Children returned to after-school programs, choir resumed under careful eyes, and neighbors learned to speak about other things in hushed tones. But whenever the church bells tolled, whenever the organ played its long, heavy notes, the story returned to the forefront of people's minds. The music sounded different now, heavier, carrying the weight of a boy no one had seen since that cold night. Detectives transferred in and out of the department, and the case files thickened with redundant reports. Each new officer assigned to review it reached the same dead end. No witnesses, no evidence, no answers. The official classification shifted from active to cold, though the boy's parents never accepted the term. To them, cold meant forgotten, and forgetting was something they could not allow. They wrote letters to state officials, hired private investigators, and even appeared on local news stations, begging anyone with information to come forward. But time only seemed to move further away from that night, burying their hope under the weight of routine silence. Whispers in the community refused to fade. Some clung to the belief that the boy had been taken by someone within the parish, a betrayal too terrible to face directly. Others insisted an outsider must have slipped through an unlocked side door. A smaller group whispered darker theories, rituals, hidden chambers, unholy secrets concealed behind the church's ancient stone. None of it was proven, yet all of it lingered in the background. Each time the organ's pipes roared during a Sunday service, those theories flared again, passed between pews in uneasy glances and murmured gossip. Each December, on the anniversary of the boy's disappearance, the family organized a candlelight vigil. At first, hundreds gathered, holding flames against the cold night air, reciting prayers and promises not to forget. The image of his face, projected on posters and banners, reminded the town of what was missing. But as the years passed, the crowds dwindled. The vigils grew smaller, quieter, until sometimes only a handful of people joined the parents in their grief. Those who stayed until the end stood in silence, candles burning low, staring at the heavy doors of the church that had swallowed their child. The boy's room at home remained untouched. His schoolbooks stayed on the shelf, his bed carefully made. Each year the decorations from holidays past were placed gently around the house, though the celebrations themselves carried little joy. His parents learned to live inside the waiting, each day a balance between demanding answers and enduring the absence of them. They sat in pews each Sunday, staring at the place where his voice had once joined the choir, listening to the hymns while trying not to imagine the countless possibilities of what had happened that night. For the wider town, the case became something spoken of in fragments, a wound they wanted to ignore but never could. Children who had sung alongside him grew older, graduated, moved away. For them, the boy's absence was a memory that blurred into their childhood. Yet for their parents, for the generation that remained, the disappearance lingered as unfinished business, an unanswered riddle. Any time the church hosted an event, any time strangers visited, the question surfaced again. How could a boy vanish inside walls that had been searched so many times by so many people? Years folded over one another, and the sense of unease settled deeper into the foundation of the community. The church continued to function, hosting weddings, funerals, and holiday services, but the story never released its grip. Those who attended admitted they often felt a strange heaviness when the organ played, as though the notes carried something unresolved. Outsiders might not have noticed, but to locals, every hymn felt tied to a loss that had no explanation. By the 10th anniversary, the boy's parents stood nearly alone at the vigil. A few close friends remained beside them, but most of the town had chosen distance. The family lit their candles, placed fresh flowers at the church steps, and spoke words into the cold night air that carried no reply. The mother's voice trembled as she promised her son that she would never stop searching, that she would keep pressing until the truth surfaced. For her, hope had never died. It had only hardened into determination. And yet, beneath the determination, an ache remained. Every poster had faded, every rumor had been recycled, every theory exhausted. The case was as frozen as the ground beneath their feet, locked in time with no cracks to let the truth through. But the silence would not last forever. The answer, though still hidden, was closer than anyone in town could imagine. Nearly a decade had passed since the boy's disappearance, and the church had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Its doors still opened on Sundays, its organ still thundered across the sanctuary, and its congregation still tried to pray in the shadow of a mystery that had never been solved. But by 2021, the aging building was in need of major repairs. The wooden beams creaked with each season, the roof leaked in storms, and the towering organ, once the pride of the parish, had fallen into disrepair. Plans were made to dismantle sections of the instrument for restoration, a task that would require pulling apart pieces of the century-old structure that had not been touched since its installation. On a gray morning in late spring, contractors moved into the choir loft with tools and scaffolding. Dust rose in clouds as they unscrewed panels and lifted pipes from their long-held positions. For many of the workers, it was routine labor, though the scale of the organ demanded care. As they pried loose sections that had sat untouched for decades, the air filled with the stale scent of wood that had been sealed away for generations. They stacked pipes neatly, swept up shavings, and carried away panels warped by time. It was during one of these sweeps that a worker paused. Wedged in the narrow space between two vertical pipes, where debris had gathered unnoticed, was something that didn't belong. At first glance, it looked like cloth, tattered and discolored with age. He pulled gently, and the fabric tore in his hands, brittle and frayed. It wasn't insulation or packing material. It was clothing. Alarm rippled through the team as they called for the foreman. The work halted immediately. They looked again into the gap, shining flashlights deeper. Beneath the cloth was more debris, and beneath that, something that froze them all in place. The foreman made the call. Within the hour, the police were back inside the church, the same sanctuary they had combed so many years before. Officers sealed off the loft and guided the workers outside. Detectives who had once handled the case, some retired, some still in service, were contacted. For the parents, now older and weathered by grief, the news came as both a shock and a cruel awakening. After years of silence, the place where their son had last been seen was once again under investigation. As forensic teams moved in, the organ that had carried hymns and prayers for decades became a crime scene. Technicians began removing pipes one by one, dismantling the structure with meticulous care. Dust coated their gloves as they reached into cavities, pulling out fragments of fabric and strands of material that had no reason to be there. And then, deeper inside one of the shafts, they found the evidence no one had dared to imagine would surface after all these years. Scraps of clothing gave way to the unmistakable outline of bone. Carefully, the team worked in silence, extracting remains that had been hidden within the instrument for nearly 11 years. The discovery confirmed what so many had feared but never been able to prove. The boy had never left the church. He had been here all along, concealed in the towering structure that loomed over every service, every vigil, every desperate search. News of the discovery spread quickly, reigniting a story many thought had faded into history. Reporters gathered outside the church, their cameras capturing the heavy police presence as evidence bags were carried out. For the community, the revelation landed like a physical blow. For years they had whispered theories, pointed fingers, and speculated about strangers. Now the truth suggested something far stranger and far more horrifying. The boy had been hidden in plain sight. For the parents, the call from detectives was both devastating and necessary. The worst had been confirmed, but at last, the not knowing was over. Their son's remains would finally be returned to them. Still, the cruelty of the revelation was impossible to ignore. For more than a decade, they had sat in that same sanctuary, hearing the organ thunder through the loft, never realizing their child was trapped within its pipes. Every hymn, every funeral, every Christmas service had carried his silence with it. Investigators knew they had to move carefully. It was not enough to recover the remains. They had to answer the questions that had haunted this case from the beginning. How had the boy ended up in the organ? Had he climbed in himself and become trapped? Had someone placed him there? Was it accident or intention? Forensic evidence would now have to do the work that witness testimony and search parties had failed to do so many years earlier. The organ stood partially dismantled, its pipes leaning in stacks across the loft. Workers who had come to restore it now stood outside the police tape, shaken by what they had uncovered. Some admitted later they wished they had never taken the job. Others said they felt the discovery had been inevitable, that something so wrong could never stay buried forever. As daylight faded, detectives packed up their findings. The loft was sealed again, this time not for worship but for analysis. The town that had grown used to silence now braced itself for a storm of new questions. What the workers had stumbled upon was not just evidence of a death, but a doorway into a truth that would shatter everything the community thought it understood about that night in 2012. The dismantling of the organ became a painstaking operation. Forensic teams worked side by side with restoration experts, carefully labeling and removing each pipe, each section of carved wood. Every screw and bracket was cataloged, not only as evidence but as potential pieces of a puzzle that had remained unsolved for nearly 11 years. Dust clung to their gloves, and the hollow echo of loosened pipes striking the floor added to the tension that already gripped the loft. No one spoke unless necessary. Everyone present understood the gravity of what they might find inside. It was late in the afternoon when the discovery came. Technicians reached a narrow vertical shaft, one of the deepest sections of the organ, rarely accessed even during maintenance. As the paneling was pried loose, the beam of a flashlight cut through the cavity, revealing shapes that immediately stopped the room cold. Bones, faintly discolored with age, rested in the dark recess where music had once reverberated. There was no mistaking it. The missing boy had been here all along. The loft fell into silence as investigators signaled for photographs and evidence bags. Every movement from that point was deliberate, every step carried out with care. The remains were fragile, wedged tightly within the metal shaft. Technicians worked for hours to extract them safely, each fragment passed carefully from gloved hands to sterile containers. Among the bones were remnants of clothing, scraps of fabric that matched the description of what the boy had worn the night he vanished. A single shoe, collapsed and brittle with time, was found pressed into the corner of the cavity. The image alone was enough to send a wave of shock through everyone present. News of the discovery spread quickly. By evening, the church steps were crowded again, though this time not with search parties or vigils, but with reporters and townspeople stunned by the revelation. For years, the organ had carried the weight of hymns, filling the sanctuary with sound, while hidden deep inside its frame was the child everyone believed had been stolen away. The realization was almost unbearable, that they had prayed beneath those pipes, that they had sung songs of faith and sorrow while his body remained concealed within feet of them. The confirmation came swiftly. Dental records verified what many already feared to accept. The remains belonged to the missing choir boy. The announcement was made publicly, a press conference held on the steps of the police station. Officers spoke carefully, avoiding speculation, but their words sent a shockwave across the state. After 11 years of questions, the boy had finally been found, not in distant woods or rivers, but within the very structure where he was last seen alive. For the parents, the news brought both devastation and a cruel kind of closure. They had begged for answers, waited through years of silence, and now the truth had emerged in the most unthinkable way. Their son had never left the sanctuary. He had been hidden in plain sight within the instrument that had marked every moment of mourning since his disappearance. Friends recalled how the mother collapsed when the confirmation was delivered, the weight of a decade's worth of grief pressing down all at once. The wider community struggled to process the revelation. For some, it reignited anger toward the initial investigation. How had search teams missed this? Why hadn't the organ been fully dismantled at the beginning? Detectives admitted quietly that the organ's size and complexity had made it difficult to access during the original sweep, and without cause to suspect it, attention had shifted elsewhere. For many in the town, that explanation offered little comfort. They had lived for over a decade believing in kidnappers, in strangers lurking in shadows, when the truth was locked inside their church the entire time. The organ itself was cordoned off indefinitely, the pipes stacked in evidence rooms instead of echoing through the sanctuary. Parishioners who gathered the following Sunday described the silence as unbearable. Without the music, the service felt hollow, but with the knowledge of what had been inside, no one wanted to hear the pipes play again. Some spoke of leaving the parish altogether, unable to reconcile their faith with the horror that had taken place within those walls. Authorities promised a full forensic analysis. They would reconstruct how the boy ended up inside the shaft, whether he had fallen in by accident or been placed there deliberately. They warned that answers would take time, but the shock of the discovery left little room for patience. Families who had once pointed fingers at each other were now forced to confront a possibility even more disturbing, that the disappearance had not required an intruder at all, only a tragic accident and an overlooked cavity within the very structure they trusted. The boy's photograph, once faded on bulletin boards, was now everywhere again, printed on news articles and broadcast on television. But this time, it was not a plea for help. It was an obituary, a confirmation that the search had ended. For some, that meant closure. For others, it meant new anger, sharper than ever before. And as the sun set on the day of the announcement, the organ towered in silence, no longer an instrument of music, but a symbol of the darkest truth imaginable. The child had never left, and the community now faced the crushing realization that for 11 long years, every hymn sung inside that sanctuary had been carried upward through pipes that concealed his silence. The loft was sealed off for weeks as forensic teams began the slow process of reconstructing what had happened. The organ, once an instrument of pride, now stood stripped of its grandeur, reduced to exposed beams and empty shafts. Specialists measured every angle, sketched diagrams, and created 3D models to understand how a child could end up inside one of its vertical pipes. The cavity where the remains were found was narrow, barely wide enough for a boy to slip into. Investigators noted that access was possible only from behind the loft, through a cramped opening that few besides maintenance workers ever saw. Theories began to form, but none offered a complete picture. The bones told part of the story. Forensic anthropologists confirmed there were no signs of blunt force trauma, no fractures that suggested violence, no marks consistent with weapons. The skeleton showed no evidence of restraint. His clothing, though degraded by time, remained largely intact. A sweater, trousers, and one shoe matched the description from the night he vanished. Nothing appeared cut or torn in a way that suggested an attack. To the investigators, the absence of foul play was both a relief and a frustration. It ruled out murder, but it did little to explain how the boy had ended up trapped. Scratches found inside the shaft complicated the picture. Forensic light revealed faint marks along the interior walls, consistent with fingernails scraping against metal. Analysts couldn't determine whether those scratches were made during an attempt to climb in or a desperate effort to get out. The distinction was crucial. One possibility suggested curiosity or accident. The other pointed to a final struggle. Without living witnesses, the truth was left to inference. Investigators considered whether the boy might have been exploring. Children were known to sneak into strange spaces, and the choir loft was filled with gaps and crawlways. If he had slipped into the cavity, the steep drop could have trapped him beyond rescue. Acoustic engineers even speculated that the hollow chamber may have muffled any cries for help, masking them beneath the resonance of the organ itself. If so, then even if he had shouted, his voice might never have carried beyond the pipes. Yet another question refused to fade. How had so many searches missed him? In the days following his disappearance, police, volunteers, and even dogs had combed through every corner of the church. The organ had been checked visually, its surface tapped, its outer compartments opened, but no one had dismantled it fully. The shaft where the boy was found required removing multiple panels and pulling out sections of pipe. At the time, investigators had assumed no child could be hidden in such a place. The oversight became a painful reminder of how assumptions can shape investigations. The discovery forced detectives to revisit their own failures. Some admitted privately that resources had been stretched thin in those early days, and pressure from the community had driven them to search outward rather than inward. The focus had shifted to the woods, the river, the highways, under the belief that abduction was more plausible. And now, with the remains in front of them, that decision weighed heavily. The boy had been closer than anyone imagined, his body concealed only by the complexity of the structure. The parents demanded answers. They wanted to know if their son had suffered, if he had called out in vain while everyone searched outside. Investigators explained what little they could. Based on environmental conditions inside the shaft, they estimated he may have survived only a few hours. The confined space would have restricted movement, made breathing difficult, and the cold air of that winter night would have accelerated hypothermia. The idea that he might have been alive while the sanctuary filled with searchers was unbearable. Experts examined whether the fall could have been accidental. The opening behind the loft was high, but not impossible for a child to reach if he had climbed onto supporting beams. Some speculated he may have been playing a game of hide-and-seek, or perhaps exploring a space no one else had noticed. Others wondered if he had been chasing something, curiosity, a sound, or even another child. But when pressed, none of the other choir members recalled playing in the loft that evening. Whatever had drawn him to the opening remained unknown. The town struggled with the findings. The confirmation of accident brought little comfort. If anything, it deepened the sense of tragedy. Parents questioned how a child could vanish within walls filled with adults, how hours of searching could overlook a place that now seemed so obvious. The scratches on the metal haunted them most. Were they signs of climbing or of desperate attempts to claw his way out? The investigators gave no definitive answer, leaving the community to wrestle with possibilities. What is afar, remains were released to the family. The funeral was quiet, attended mostly by close friends and relatives. The service was held in a different parish, far from the organ loft where he had been found. Mourners gathered in silence, their grief compounded by the knowledge that the truth had been there all along, just out of reach. For the parents, the burial marked an end to the search, but not an end to the questions. They left the cemetery with the same ache they had carried for years, the sense that something essential was still missing. And as investigators filed their final reports, they admitted openly what the evidence could not deny. No proof of foul play, no fingerprints, no fibers that pointed to anyone else. Only the bones of a boy, intact clothing, faint scratches, and a shaft that should have been impossible to enter. The official ruling leaned toward accident, but beneath the stamp of closure lingered doubt. Because even after forensics had said their final word, one question remained unresolved. How had an entire town searched so hard for so long and still failed to find him? The discovery of the boy's remains answered the question of where he had gone, but it opened a new chapter of torment. How? Investigators gathered behind closed doors, piecing through the possibilities that still hung in the air. One of the simplest theories was also the most painful, that the boy had been hiding. Children at choir often played games, slipping behind curtains or sneaking into small spaces while waiting for parents. If he had decided to crawl into the narrow opening at the back of the organ, he could have fallen deeper than he intended, wedged in a place impossible to escape. The scratches inside the shaft seemed to support this version, marks that looked like attempts to move upward. It painted a picture of a child's innocent game, ending in an accident that would haunt an entire community for over a decade. but there were other possibilities that could not be dismissed. Investigators questioned whether someone else could have been involved, deliberately or through negligence. Could an adult have discovered him inside the shaft and failed to act, fearful of blame or scandal? Could someone have placed him there, though no evidence pointed to restraint or injury? The absence of violence in the remains did not eliminate the darker theories. It only made them harder to prove. Detectives debated late into the night, dividing between those who leaned toward tragic accident and those who suspected something more deliberate. Experts were consulted to understand what the boy might have endured. Survivability studies showed that in such confined conditions, with cold winter air circulating through the organ, he could have remained alive for several hours, perhaps as long as a day. The notion was unbearable. His parents sat through these explanations with hands trembling, imagining their son calling out from within the pipes, while searchers combed the woods and police questioned neighbors. One expert went further, suggesting that if the organ had been played in the hours after he was trapped, the roar of the pipes could have masked his cries. That detail cut deepest of all, the idea that his voice may have been lost beneath the very music he once loved to sing. Rumors, once dormant, sprang to life again in the community. Some insisted the child had been mischievous, sneaking into a forbidden space without understanding the danger. Others whispered about secrets, cover-ups, negligence, or deliberate concealment. Every theory carried weight in someone's mind, and the absence of definitive proof left the space wide open for speculation. Parents of other choir children asked themselves if their sons or daughters had noticed something that night, some detail dismissed at the time but important now. None of the grown children, now in their 20s, recalled anything more than confusion, the sudden shock of realizing their friend was gone. Detectives released no final statement immediately, unwilling to stamp closure on a case that still contained unanswered questions. The official line was cautious. No evidence of foul play, but circumstances remained unclear. The parents, however, clung to the possibility that someone knew more than they had admitted. They couldn't accept that their son had died only feet away while dozens of adults stood nearby, unable to hear him. They returned often to the church in the weeks after the discovery, standing in the loft, staring at the gutted organ, listening to the silence that had replaced its music. Theories even reached into the architecture of the building. Engineers examined blueprints, noting how the organ's design created deep, resonant chambers that could amplify sound outward while swallowing noise from within. The acoustics, some argued, might have created the cruelest of illusions. The boy could have screamed, but no one outside the shaft would have heard more than a muffled vibration lost in the organ's voice. This possibility left parents and parishioners alike struggling with guilt, haunted by the thought that they had been too close, too present, to rescue him. The town became divided. Some pushed to label the death an accident, believing the family needed the closure that finality could bring. Others resisted, demanding deeper inquiry, fearful that accepting accident meant turning away from the possibility of hidden truth. The debate wasn't just about evidence, it was about belief, about how a community chose to explain something inexplicable. For the boy's parents, there was no comfort in either conclusion. Accident meant their child had died alone in fear. Foul play meant betrayal by someone they might have trusted. Neither answer gave them peace. At night, when the church stood empty, residents reported seeing its windows differently. The structure no longer carried the same weight of safety or ritual. It loomed, now as a reminder of unanswered cries, of music that had hidden silence too well. The organ pipes, once a symbol of worship, had become a monument to something no one could fully understand. And as the case edged toward its conclusion, one truth remained unshaken. Whether it was accident or something more sinister, the boy had been alive when he entered that shaft. And the thought that his final moments may have unfolded unheard, drowned out by hymns rising through the very pipes that concealed him, left investigators and parents alike with a question that could never be erased. How close had they been to saving him, and how had they all missed it? The case officially closed with a single phrase typed onto the final report. accidental entrapment. It was the simplest explanation investigators could give, the only one supported by the evidence. The boy had climbed or fallen into the shaft of the organ, become trapped, and died there unseen. But for those who had lived with the mystery for more than a decade, the explanation felt too thin, too neat. The unanswered questions clung to the town like the dust inside the old loft. Parents asked why, during those desperate first days, the organ had not been dismantled piece by piece. They remembered dogs losing the trail at the altar, officers combing every stairwell, volunteers sweeping basements and rafters. Why had no one thought to go deeper? For some, the failure was an oversight born of urgency. For others, it was harder to accept. They whispered that perhaps someone had known, perhaps there had been a reason not to look too closely. With every retelling, suspicion shifted, but proof never followed. The boy's parents carried a different burden. They had begged for answers, pressed for action, clung to hope even when hope was long gone. Now, with remains returned and the grave filled, they were left with silence that no ruling could resolve. Accident meant no villain, no one to hold accountable, and no way to erase the thought that their son's cries may have been lost beneath the sound of hymns. It was closure, in name only, an ending that still felt like a question. The church replaced the old organ with a new one, its polished pipes gleaming in the light of the stained glass windows. Each Sunday, the music rose again, filling the sanctuary just as it always had. But for those who knew the story, the sound carried a weight it never had before. Every note was a reminder that the previous instrument had concealed a secret for 11 years, that a child's silence had lived inside its voice. The organ no longer symbolized worship or comfort. It symbolized the line between what was known and what would never be known. And so, the town moved forward, but never fully beyond. The case became a story parents told their children as a warning, a caution about curiosity in hidden spaces. Yet beneath the caution was the truth no one could deny. A boy had vanished in plain sight, remained missing, while hundreds searched and was only discovered when time and renovation forced the walls of silence open. 11 years later, the mystery still lingered, unresolved in its details, echoing through every hymn the new organ played, a chilling reminder of the boy who never came home.